random video. Let me introduce her for those of you who don't know her, if you're not lucky enough to work with her like I do occasionally. So today's speaker is Vanessa Reyes Esteves, and she's been teaching EFL in Portugal for the past 23 years. She currently teaches English for academic purposes and English methodology, and she's taught in both private and public state schools. She's got a master's in Anglo-American studies, and she's involved in teacher training all around the world. I'm lucky because she works with me in Oxford in the summer where we run a course together. She presently writes course material for EFL students, and outside of her work for OUP, she's written for the ETpedia for young learners, which was published by Pavilion a year or so ago. Her interests are teaching YLs, pre-teens, and critical thinking, and she's here today to talk about project learning. So Vanessa, can I hand over to you, please? Are you there for me?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me? Right. Hello, everyone. Hi there. Can you just type in if you can hear so I feel more comfortable and reassured? Right. That seems to be working, and I presume you can see me as well. Welcome to today's webinar. It's a true pleasure to be with you and to see so many of you online from all over the world. This always amazes me, no matter how many times we do this. Right, today we'll be speaking about project-based learning, and I'll be asking you a question or two. So my first question is, do you teach young learners? If you teach young learners like I do, can you just type in the box so we can see how many of you there are? Oh, I see the chat box is going, so quite a few. No, for sure. Right, yes, quite a few teachers teaching young learners. Dean used to, okay. Right, what about Sarah teaches teenagers? And that was my next question. How many of us teach teenagers? Natasha, yes. Okay, quite a few of us. Does anybody teach adults? Is anybody involved in academic English? Yeah. Right, so we seem to have a fair spread. Now, I've kept today's webinar quite general, although I've used an example from my Young Learner classroom. So I am going to challenge you to think about what I'm saying and to think about how you could adapt that for your classrooms rather than just saying, oh, this wouldn't work in mine. Right, I see somebody who's teaching both young learners and teens. That's quite common. Right, so today we have 4 objectives, as you can see, and I do apologize for my crazy numbering, which I've just noticed now. So, you know, these automatic things on computers, sometimes they don't quite do what you want them to. So we'll start off by discussing exactly what we understand by PBL, and then we'll move into the challenges of implementing this approach in the classroom. After we've done that, then we'll be having a look at some steps which you can take to guide you in implementing a project. And finally, we'll dedicate a few minutes to discussing how we can evaluate project work. So quite a busy agenda for the next hour. Are you ready to go on a little trip down project-based lane with me? Right. Oh, yes, I see quite a few of you are. Right, so without further ado, you know I'm a teacher and we teachers like to know whether our students are listening. So I have a tiny, easy little question for you. And my first question is, does anybody know what the acronym PBL stands for? Now, I did warn you that this was an easy question. Ashran, do you? Natasha, no? Yes, could you type in if you do? Imani? That's it, Maria, project-based learning. So that was my easy question. Now let's move on to one that makes you think. PBL is project-based learning, but does anybody know who coined the term and when? So I wonder if this is a very modern term that we've started using, or whether this term has been around for a little bit longer. No, Sarah? Philip, no? Are you curious? Yeah. Ah, Sean, you win the prize. I'll have to bring you a chocolate when we go back to Oxford. Yeah, the term was in fact coined by John Dewey, who, as you probably may remember, was an American philosopher and educator. Now, the really interesting thing is that the term was coined in the 19th century, back in 1897, when Dewey wrote My Pedagogical Creed. And back then, he was already speaking about the importance of getting students to learn by doing. So we know that when we preach to students, they tend to forget 80% of what we tell them. But when they learn for themselves by doing, the number is reverted. And I think that this is quite an impressive fact. And it's also amazing to think that a term which has been around for so long is finally gaining the prominence that it deserves in our 21st century framework, which is really based around the student and motivating the student to learn and promoting lifelong learning both in and out the classroom. So this is just a little curiosity for you. Now, are you ready for another challenge just to warm you up? Maternity takes a lot of your brain. Well, Natasha, you know what they say about sleep. It's not overrated, and maternity does tend to deprive you of sleep. Right, now I'm sure that Maria Montessori also used the term herself, so it's become quite popular nowadays, and nowadays many people speak about it. Right, so my challenge for you is, I wonder whether we can come up with 5 really good reasons to bring project-based learning into our classroom. So can you have a good think? Why would you want to bring that into your classroom? What's a really good reason to make you tweak the way that you're teaching, or at least vary it a little more? I wonder who's going to be the first person to type in the chat box. Let's see. Mohammed, yes, it definitely does provide a hands-on experience. So the students are working. And Sarah, you've just complimented what Mohammed is saying by saying that it leads to teamwork, but also at the same time to student autonomy. And this is absolutely essential in the workplace nowadays. Right, Declan, you learn best when you experience it, of course. And Yelena, I love the fact that you're stressing creativity. Can I challenge you to explain what exactly you mean by that? So Nim agrees with cooperation, elaboration, and of course, if we speak about creativity, we do need to speak about critical thinking because they go hand in hand. Sonia has hit the nail on the head there by saying we're promoting real life skills, the kind of skills that students will need in the workplace. And Monica, I couldn't agree with you more when you say that it is more motivating for students. So many times we see students dozing off in class or going off into their own world. But if they're actually engaged, there's more of a chance that they will remember what they're learning and transfer it from their short-term memory into their long-term memory. Hi, Husni, welcome. Right, so there are lots of good reasons to implement a project-based learning approach in the classroom. And I've just chosen a quote by Colleen MacDonald, which I think summarizes what you're all saying. And she stresses this child-centered approach to learning. But she mentions something which you haven't and which is also very, very important. And she mentions that project-based learning allows students to work at their level of skill. Now, I think this is really, really important with the number of students that we have in our classrooms nowadays. So can I ask you how many students you have in your classroom on average? Do you have the 15 that we all dream of? Oh, Monica has 25. Leanne has 6. You're really lucky. 15 to 25. About 10, 30, that would be more or less the number here in Portugal as well. 15 to 22. Imani, 39. That's a lot of students in the classroom. Now, if you're speaking about 20, 25 students, how many levels of English would you say that you have in your classroom? Do you just have one level because you're teaching English for pre-intermediate or intermediate, right? 3 levels, you'd say, multiple levels, yeah. And the question is, in a lesson, are you able to cater for all of those different level students? Or do you sort of try to choose one during different moments of your lesson? So we do try, But I mean, there's only so much we can do. Maria, I love your no, because yes, of course, if you have 25 students, you probably have about 25 different levels. Nobody knows exactly the same thing. Now, whilst I agree with you, Shahid, so we do try to teach different levels, it's really, really difficult to do this. But through project-based learning, we can get students to work at the level that they feel more comfortable with. And this, for me, is one of the biggest advantages of project-based learning ever. Now, another thing that I particularly like is the fact that children are given choices. So they're able to choose what they want to work at, and they're able to choose how they want to work at this. So, as you mentioned, they're able to ask all these sorts of questions about the world around them and develop the kind of skills that they will need to become global learners and to become global citizens later on in life. So this leads us on then to the characteristics of project-based learning. What exactly is project-based learning? Let's take a look that's a little bit more in depth. Now, I've chosen to start off with a child-friendly approach because in project-based learning, the child is really the alpha and omega of everything that goes on in the classroom. In other words, everything is going to be designed for the child, but everything is also going to stem from the child. And so the child will be very, very active throughout the whole learning process. Now, how does this start? Well, project-based learning always starts off with a challenging problem or question. In other words, we're going to introduce something that we're all curious about or that we'd like to know the answer to, and then we're going to design a whole project to help us find the answer to that question. Now, notice the word challenging. That's not a question that we already know the answer to. And you know, as teachers, we have this little habit of asking questions in the classroom. Have you noticed? Now, we also have the habit of asking the question and then actually answering it. I wonder if that's happened to you before. And I'll give you an example. If I ask you, do you know what PBL stands for? That's the kind of question which I kind of expect you to know the answer to because you've enrolled in a project-based learning webinar. In other words, I'm not really asking a very authentic and communicative question, but in a project, the questions are always authentic and they do lead to a lot of communication. Now, does this make sense to you? Yeah? Right, I wonder if there are any questions at this point or whether we can move on. Let's just see if there's anybody that's feeling a little confused at this point. Right, now, as everybody is involved in coming up with this question, then everybody is active and engaged and motivated to learn. So this obviously means the students, but it also means the teacher. Because as this interaction is happening in the classroom, students are learning from us, but we're also learning from the students. And we might even be researching a question that we wouldn't know the answer to because, well, we're simply not interested in that particular topic. Now, it's very, very important to stress that our role as teachers is not going to be the sage on the stage. So we're not going to transmit content to students. Instead, we're going to become guides on the sides, which actually means that we're going to facilitate learning for the students. Now, Sarah, you're asking whether the kids actually come up with their own question. Well, let's take a minute and think about your question there. What would the advantages be of the children or the students, if you're teaching teenagers or adults, coming up with their own questions? Would you type in the chat box, what do you think might be beneficial in that approach if they're actually inventing their own question? In other words, they have the liberty within a certain topic to choose anything they want to learn about. Let's see. Well, that's it, Sarah. It's something that they genuinely want to know. So they are curious about it. And so, as Dornier would mention, we're speaking about inner motivation there. We're not intrinsic motivation. We're not speaking about extrinsic motivation. And as you probably remember, intrinsic motivation is more long-lasting. Now, I really like what Inge is saying here. There's more variety. That's true, because kids and our students have this way of thinking of things that we don't even think about. So yes, there's more variety in there. And also there might be core questions. They might actually be asking questions that are related to their talents or to their difficulties. Okay. So they are thinking about the problem. Yes, and as Natasha is saying, they're very, very active. In other words, they're not just passively waiting for you to give them the answer. So there are quite a few advantages to the students coming up with the question there. Now let's look at the other side of the coin. What if we teachers suggest a topic for a project? What would the advantages be there? Let's have a look. So we've thought about it, we've looked at it with our teacher brain, we've come up with a topic that we think is really interesting for the students and for that particular unit. Let's see, what might the advantages be there? Oh, I see the chat box is ferociously coming alive. Right, it could definitely be more structured. I definitely agree. Right, Nadia has raised an important point. So we would definitely have to suggest, but then watch out for the reaction of the students. And yes, Sarah, we do have a broader view of the needs of the class, but sometimes we become so teacher focused that we forget about the excitement of learning. So we give them a topic that they're not all that interested in. Okay, right. So you would have to weigh this, Sarah, and think about what you think is more beneficial for your students. However, speaking from experience, I'd say that perhaps you could have a little bit of one approach and a little bit of the other. And that's why I've spoken about the teacher as a facilitator. Whilst we're not going to impose a topic, I do feel that we could give the students 2 or 3 suggestions to get them going. In other words, they're not starting off from a void. We're giving them some guiding posts, and then they can take that topic and tweak it or personalize it even further, or perhaps even change it because they're interested in something else. So I would say that perhaps we could follow a mixed approach. Now, we'll be speaking about the syllabus in a little bit, Elena. So if you could just wait patiently just for a few slides and then we'll go on. Right, yes, Nadia, I would agree that this blending is very beneficial because you tend to get the best out of both worlds. So what are you getting? Well, you're getting meaningful topics along with this expertise and broader vision that you were speaking about in the chat box. So we know exactly which key skills we want to develop. And we're doing this while guaranteeing a hands-on approach that's very motivating for everybody that's involved in the project. Now, project-based learning is fantastic, but you cannot forget that you have different levels of students in your classroom. So you'll have students that are naturally very good and are able to do things very, very quickly. And I'm sure that you can think of a name or two of a student like that in your classroom. But you also have students that need a little longer to get there. It's not that they can't do it, they can, but perhaps they need a little bit more guidance or a little bit more support. And so this is something that you'll have to think about continuously as you carry out a project. How can I scaffold the project for my students? Yes, and we are speaking about 2 different levels, or perhaps some even more, right? And yes, we're also going to be speaking about Bloom's taxonomy and how project-based learning can take students from the lots or the lower order thinking skills into the HOTS. Now, project-based learning is quite similar to task-based learning. The major difference, in my opinion, is that it's even more ambitious. And this is why I've stressed that we're exploring a project in depth. While you can have a task in one lesson or in a part of a lesson, a project always implies a number of lessons. And depending on your syllabus and the time that you have, you might do this in a unit, but you might also dedicate a whole semester to a project or perhaps even a whole year. So there's an important concept to think about. Now, all this is good and well, and I can see that you're all motivated by projects, but we are teachers in the real world. So let me ask you a little question. Are you currently implementing a project in your classroom? Let's see how many of us are. So at this very moment, are you implementing a project? So here is yes. Okay. Don't worry, Teresa, you can watch the video afterwards. Right, so there are a few no's, a few sometimes. Sarah has done a few in the past. So if we're not all implementing projects just now, then might I ask you, what are the challenges that you feel in your classrooms in relation to implementing a project? So why are we not doing this more? What's more challenging about a project-based learning approach? Now, Ekateris hits an important point there, planning. It does take a lot of work to plan a good project. And Liane, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing your name correctly, and I apologize if I'm not. It is definitely time consuming. And this is a huge problem when we have a syllabus that's really, really, really big. Right, so Sarah's also speaking about teaching FCE. In other words, you have a huge exam coming up and you're short of time. You need to train students for the exam. Right, Nadia, you're right. Monitoring, it does give us a lot of work and you need to be paying attention to everything the students are doing. Right, it might not fit the moment or even the topic that you're doing in your syllabus might not be the best topic for a project. So as you can see, there are lots of good reasons why we don't always go for a project-based learning approach to learning. I've chosen a few of my concerns. Have a look and see whether you agree with them. And if you do, you can just type in the chat box so I know that I'm not alone. Now, one of the reasons that I've mentioned is this problem of student dynamics. I wonder if you, like me, have a few students who will come up to you and say, Vanessa, I will do the work, but I don't want to work with Mary. I don't like her. Or I'd rather work with Tim. We're not friends, you know, whoever she's working with. Yeah, I see that you're in the same boat as me. So this is a problem sometimes, convincing students that they can't always work with the people that they like. They need to work with students who will help them learn better. And a lot of work has to be done around building positive group dynamics. Now, another issue is thinking of a really, really good driving question, and a question which will carry the whole project through. That leads us on then to the end project. And the end project is what the students are going to work towards and create to show students or to show the community what they've learning. I'm just going to go back to a comment that I've just noticed in the chat box, which is that some members are passive, and that's very, very true. So you'll have to really watch out for what your students are learning and give them a very, very clear agenda so that each student in the group has a role and knows exactly what they're doing when and how they are contributing to this overall project. Now, this end product is going to be more effective when we have public feedback. In other words, when we have an audience that's more than just the teacher. And that's not always easy. It's easy for us to look at our students' work and to give them an opinion, but it's not necessarily easy to get parents to come in or perhaps to publish work that students have done, because you might have one or two parents who doesn't give you permission to do this. And then you have a big issue. How do I involve that student? Because if the student is working, but the student can't be, imagine that you've made a film and the student can't appear in the film, the student does tend to feel a little bit let down. So how do we involve these students in the project is a good question. Right, we've spoken about projects relating to students' lives. In other words, they need to move out from theory and they need to go into something that's practical for the students. But they also need to be based on research. Now, this research should come in through multiple forms. So yes, students should be Googling on the internet, but they should also be looking at different forms of knowledge. In other words, they probably need a library. And that's where things get a little bit more complicated. Can I ask you if you have a good library in your school, or if you have a good public library nearby where students can go into and have a look at different fonts? Right, let's see. No, you see, and this is one of the problems. We don't just want the students to have a look at the internet, but if you don't have a library, then you are going to have to do some research before and have a look at different corners or different kinds of sites where students can get information, right? I'm a big fan of books, so I do like them always to fidget around with a paper book and to learn how to use the index and the glossary and things like this, that Google just automatically finds it for you. But you should also bear in mind that if they are Googling on the internet, you will have to teach them about netiquette, for example, and you'll also have to teach them how to differentiate a good, reliable site from a site that, well, any old twat could have invented, right? Okay, so yes, I would agree, Leanne, that the learners do depend a lot on the internet. Right, now we've raised the time factor. A good project has to span over a certain time. So this brings all these time issues into the classroom. Sarah's problem of having to prepare students for the exam, and of course the syllabus that we have, which is, well, huge. Natalia, we were speaking about having a library so that we could give students access to different fonts and not just the internet. And the point about a library is that it helps them do research skills as well and use things like glossaries or indexes, which, I mean, if you type in on Google, it just does the work for you and it finds the information that you need. So just complementing the kind of research that we do online with paper research. And yes, Saista, you could use PDFs of books, although I wonder how legal that is. Right, now, a good project will also have to be embedded with knowledge and skills. In other words, we're not just teaching content, and we're going to have to pull out the best skills for our students. You can't have them learning a whole huge range of things. So you need to focus in what that project is going to develop in more detail. And then I'd move on to giving students feedback. Now, we all love getting good feedback, but sometimes we need to get the feedback that we need to hear rather than the feedback that we like. And this is if we are going to grow as students. Now, when you give your students more constructive feedback, how do they react to this? Do you have a student in your classroom that tends to know everything, tends to be a shiny star? And then when you point out an area of improvement, they close their learning gates. They don't want to take that feedback on board. Now, this can be a challenge, and we have to think about how we're going to give students feedback. And then, of course, we need to move on and think about assessment. How are we going to assess students in the project? What skills are we going to assess? What weight are we going to give to the different elements in the project? So as you can see, there's quite a lot to do. So it's quite natural that we ask, well, where do we begin? And if that's the question on your mind, then I have a little, well, recipe for you. Would you like to have a look and see how I suggest you go about this? Right, so we're going to start off with students because they are, after all, the beginning and the end of our project. And the first point is going to be to get the students on board. Now, this starts way before we start implementing a project. It starts at the beginning of the year when we meet our students, because the first step is to get to know them as people. Only then will we be able to understand their passions and start to see what they are naturally interested in. So you will have to build in moments where you have group dynamics and group bonding activities, and when you actually get to know that little Juan loves football, but Mike prefers basketball. So although they both love sports, they love different sports. And this will also help you understand what their talents are, which can then feed into a project as well. Now, it's really, really important that we stop and listen to students and that we don't impose anything on them, but we actually get to know them as people themselves. Now, once you've done that, then you're ready to move on to the project. Now, I'm going to ask you the most difficult question of the whole webinar. Are you ready for a really difficult question? Yeah. Right now, I know I've just met you, but I'm hoping that you will trust me enough to be your teacher today. So what I'm really asking is, do you trust me enough to put on your student's hat and be my student for the next 5 or 6 minutes? Yeah, thank you so much for trusting me. Okay, so could I please ask you to divide your brain into two? Have half of your brain as the teacher that you are, because you know once we're a teacher, we're always a teacher and always thinking about how we can use things in our classroom. But then, David, thanks for trying. Could you please try to experience the activity genuinely as a student? Okay. Now, I explained at the beginning of the webinar that I've chosen an example for today's webinar out of the book that I'm using, which is called Project. And I've just shown you the first unit. So if you have a look at this page in my course book, you'll see that the topic is, of course, what are we studying in this unit? Well, have a look at all those lovely pictures. Yo, I see this chat box going. The verb can, yes, we're doing that as well. And what's the general topic? Life and more particularly sports. You see, this is why I love teachers. You always know the right answer. Okay, so if I go into the classroom and say, children, have a look at the new unit. What's the topic? And they tell me, as you're telling me, sports or life or abilities, capacities. My next question is going to be, well, knowing that we are going to study this topic, what kind of questions would you like to find out the answers to? So things that you might be curious about, or perhaps even love, or perhaps not be too certain about. So you'd like to find out the answer so that you absolutely know. Can I give you a minute to go into your me brain and think about what question you'd like to find out the answer to about this topic? And it doesn't matter whether the answer is in our course books. Don't worry about that. We'll have time to find the answer. Okay. So we have our first question today. Can sports help us in any way? Okay, you'd like to find out which sports you like. Okay, right, Mr. Muta, you'd also like to find out what sports you like. Okay, can we think of any other questions? Physical activities, are they really that good for your health or not? Yes. Oh, that's an interesting question, Maria Carla. What sports do British children like us like? Why do people do sports? Right, so as you can see, you're coming up with lots of different questions. Now, I warn you that the first few times that you do this, the students tend to come up with very, very literal questions, just as you've done now. But as you tweak this and as you show them different ways of making questions, then they start coming up with more detailed or deeper questions. Oh, I like this question, Marina. What new sports are becoming popular? Right, and I'd like to show you the questions that my students came up with. Would you like to have a peek at their little brains for a minute? Oh, the best sportsman of the Euro decade. Oh, that's quite difficult. There are quite a few good sportsmen now. That's an interesting question, Maria. Right, so have a look. Like you, they've come up with some very simple questions, but they've decided to think about the best sports to play or do. Let me contextualize this for you. They want a sport that helps them stay in shape, but they want to reduce the risk of sports injuries, because we spoke about injuries and how sometimes you can really, really hurt yourself. Right, like you, they're also interested in the advantages of doing sports. And I have a student or two that would like to become a professional sportsman. So they already play sports, but they're not quite sure how to get to the top yet. Have a look at this question. That's quite similar to the British children question. How can sports reflect our culture? In other words, are there different sports that people play in different countries and are really well known for those countries? My students are 11, Sonia. So they're just finishing primary school. They're in their last year, 11, 12, right? And have a look at this question. This is my favorite of all, but I'm really into culture and an intercultural approach. So we speak a lot about this in the classroom. And I was really, really pleased to see that the kids were thinking about how they could use sports to unite different cultures and different people. In other words, to find out what we had in common rather than what we had that was different. Isn't that absolutely delicious? I like that too, Maria. Right, now once they've done this, then we're ready to move on to the next step. And now I'm going to put up all these questions on the board. We're going to discuss them and we're going to start thinking about the project that we want to do. And this is where the power of choice comes in. And I think it's really, really important to bear in mind that not all the different groups, if you're working in groups, need to be doing the same project. They could be doing different mini projects, which leads to a big project. And if we're thinking about our final end product, not all the groups need to be making the same end product. So what PBL allows you to do is really to cater for the specific talents or needs of the different students. But it is very, very important that as you give children all this choice, you also establish clear boundaries for them. So you show them clear project goals and you show them exactly how that project is going to be evaluated so that there are no nasty surprises. And yes, Nadia, competition goes a long way in the teen or even in the young learner classroom. So at this step, we now move on to deciding what kind of project we'd like to do about sports. So I'd ask you, we'd speak about that and we'd examine the advantages of doing that sport and perhaps some of the challenges so that we could come up and make an informed choice. And then we can have a voting ballot, and there are fantastic online tools and apps that you can use where everybody can vote anonymously. Or you can just have a traditional old ballot box where everybody votes, puts their vote in, and then we count the votes and choose the project that the class would like to do so that it's fair. Once we've done that, then we're going to move on into end projects. In other words, we're working towards a product, and what product would you like to do? So let's take the last question, which you seem to like. How could sports help bring cultures together? What kind of end project could we make? Any ideas? Something that we're working towards, and at the end we'll make this to show everybody what we've learned and to make them aware of the same topic, right? And this need to bring cultures together through sports. So that's, oh, I love that idea. Producing a video, yes. Right, so the students we could even organize a sports day, Sahal, and students could have a go at playing different sports. Or we could have a look at a story about peace and a story about peace through sports. We could have a quiz. You've got fantastic ideas. I think I'm going to bring you into my classroom. Right, so the question is, what kind of end products can you think of? And I've made a few suggestions for you. You've already typed all these wonderful ideas. Oh, I like this idea as well, Marina, interviewing other kids at school. Have a look at these suggestions that I've put together. Now, I've tried to group them in different types of groups of activities. You could create a sort of a discovery center. And this is going back to your idea about sports and playing sports, where they could experience the different sports. We could also perhaps organize a kind of museum exposition with a photo gallery, and then perhaps write, if you have younger learners, just a sentence about each photograph. We could have a sports day celebration, or perhaps even a presentation about the Olympic Games, because the Olympic Games tend to do that. You could also have a bulletin display. You've spoken about making videos, so demonstrations, or an actual video like a documentary or even a video presentation. We could start simple with a poster, and it's also important to remember that it's okay to start simple. Then this might not be the best activity for this particular topic, but a parade is usually quite fun for the kids as well, where they can step into the shoes of another character and then show what they've learned. They could also create a song about sports and about bringing world peace. So going back to your idea of a story, I think it was Leanne that mentioned that. So they could follow up the story with a song. They could even make a little play, or perhaps have a letter for change and ask their mayor to promote more sports activities, for example. Perhaps they could come up with a mascot for sports and world peace, or produce a small model. So when we think about an Olympic stadium, perhaps they could come up with a model of that. Perhaps they could have a fair where they show students different types of sports and how you play them, right? So as you can see, coming back to somebody's idea about interviewing other students, they could also have an interview, or perhaps even just make a news report. So as you can see, the possibilities are limitless. All you need to do is listen to your students and then show them a creative idea or two, and they can probably come up with even better ideas than these. So I hope that you have a good idea here that you can take back into your classroom. Right, so what we're really doing is speaking about an approach to learning that goes way beyond just teaching language. But what we really are doing is having sort of an onion ring approach to learning, because we're always starting off by learning about a real world topic. Then we're learning about the language that we need to learn about this topic. And as we're doing that, we're also learning about different social skills or dispositions that we can use to teach students about these topics. Now, this is really, really cool and interesting and motivating, but it also presents us with another problem, which is scaffolding. Not all students have the same language level, and sometimes students don't have a language level which allows them to go onto the internet and actually see and understand the core content that they need. So you may also have to think about the possibility of letting them do some research in L1 and then translating it into language which they can do. And yes, a glossary can help, but depending on your student's language level, even that might not be enough, if that makes sense to you. So it's really important to think about scaffolding at a language level, but also as a skills level. There are different skills that students need, and if they're not good at collaborating, you also have to scaffold that. Now, it's very important that as you're doing this scaffolding, you don't interrupt students to correct their English with the mistakes that they're making. Pictographs, yes, that's a lovely strategy as well, Shaitsa. Now, if you're not going to interrupt students to correct the language mistakes that they are making, how are you going to make them become more aware of these mistakes? And I love playing the language clinic. So what I do is, as I go around and monitor the students' work and be the guide on the side there for them and give them ideas, or perhaps just help them tweak their ideas and see the advantages or the limits of what they're proposing, then I have a little book that looks like this, right? And I just jot down the most common mistakes that I hear students make. And then later on, I bring them to the language clinic. So what I'll do is I'll prepare a little PowerPoint with 5 or 6 sentences, and I'll invite the students to become specialists, and they have to look at the sentence and see what disease that patient has got and then suggest a cure. So are you ready to become language doctors for the next 2 or 3 minutes? Let's see. Now, our first sentence is suffering from a terrible disease. Have a look at this. So this patient is saying, "Is my turn now?" And if we don't cure this patient, I'm afraid that he may get even sicker. So can anybody identify what disease this patient is suffering from? And can you suggest how we could cure the patient? Let's see. is my turn now. What might they be suffering from? Oh, Christina, you won the prize today. That was super quick. Yes, Mohammed Mehdi. Yes, they're suffering from the subject syndrome. That's it. So what we want is to give the patient a subject. In other words, we could have it is my turn now, or we could even go for a different, shorter form. So the abbreviation it's. Okay. Of course, you can use that in your classroom, Natasha. Right, one more today because we're running out of time. Have a look at this one. We didn't have got enough time. Oh dear, we didn't have got enough time. What's this patient suffering from today? Oh dear. Oh yes, they have got. Yes. And what are they doing? Well, they're confusing the verb have with the verb have got, aren't they? So can anybody suggest a cure? Yes, this definitely is a functional error. Right, let's see a cure for this poor patient. We didn't have enough time, of course. So as you can see, what I'm doing is I'm taking the mistakes that the students usually make and I'm playing around with them in class. And then sometimes I get the students to make little posters and we put them up on the walls just to remind us of these more common mistakes. And so it's a very positive approach to the kind of mistakes that we're making in the classroom. Now, as we're teaching the language, we're also teaching the social dispositions. So we need to ask, apart from teaching language and apart from teaching the children about this particular topic, in our case, sports and how sports can bring cultures together, what kind of social dispositions do I want the students to develop? And I've just put down a few that I usually do in my classroom. But I should warn you that you cannot do all of these in one day. I would say that you need to choose the magic number. Does anybody know what the magic number is? How many do you think would actually be doable to work in the classroom? Natasha, if you were here, I'd give you a pat on the back. 3 is the magic number. But yes, Nadia, between 2 and 3. So choose 2 for one part or one task, and then choose another 2 for another task, and slowly over the project, work on all of these. But remember to stress to the students what you're working on which particular day. Don't expect them to have a teacher brain and just understand what you're doing. And as you do that, also remember to highlight the different intellectual dispositions that we're working on. So you can say, today we're going to be working on our curiosity, or today we're going to develop our desire to find answers. And how could we do this? Get the students to give you the kind of solutions that they would be willing to implement. So as you can see, there's a lot of deep learning going on here. Which then brings me on to my next point. A project is a process, and what we want to do is what Carol Reeds encourages us to do, which is to catch the children at being right. So if we want to catch the children at being right, we need to show them when they are being right so that they can be right again and repeat those strategies that they are already implementing successfully. And then again, we also need to show them how they can improve or tweak strategies or skills which are not yet ripe. So how are we going to give them feedback? And can I ask you how you usually give your students feedback? What do you usually do? How do you make them aware of what they're doing that's good, and then the different areas that they can still work on? Right, and this is quite a tricky thing, especially with those students who are very good and are overachievers. They're used to being right all the time, and when they're not right, they don't react all that well. So sharing, definitely that kind of approach. Feedback could be spoken or written. Yes, we could have stars or little smiley faces even. Yes, constantly giving them appraisals and peer feedback. Okay. Now, when we're speaking about evaluation, I'd like to show you the strategy that I use. And I use the sandwich strategy feedback approach. I wonder if you've heard of this before. So basically what I do is I always give them 3 little bits of feedback. We've seen that that's the magic number. So we're going to start off with a positive thing that the student has done. And then we're going to mention an area for improvement, and it's really important that you give them the language functions to do this, or they will do it in L1. And it's perfectly okay that you have feedback in L1 and then perhaps summarize it in L2, right? And then we're going to end off on a positive note. So first of all, I tell you something that you're really good at. Then I suggest an area for improvement, not just point it out, but also make a suggestion so the student knows what to do better the next time. And then at the end, showing them again, oh, but you've done this really well. Well done. Continue doing this. Be my shiny star, as you were saying. Right, now when it comes to evaluating the project, we then have to think about what kind of rubric we're going to go for. Are you only going to evaluate the final product? Are you only going to evaluate the language, because that's what we would have traditionally done? Or are you also going to look at those intellectual dispositions? Are you going to look at the social skills? In other words, are you going to look at the process and also at the way students are receiving feedback and implementing feedback and also giving feedback? So although I cannot give you a magic rubric, because that would depend on your students and also on your schools, it is important that you build a rubric for a particular project, focusing on these different aspects, rather than just limiting yourself to focus and evaluate language. And then, of course, it's really important that you share the students' learning with the rest of the world. Now, when we ask children to write a paragraph for us and to hand it in for the teacher to correct, how many people correct that paragraph or that story? Imagine that you've asked them to write a story about sports or a sports event, and they're handing it in. How many people are going to correct that? How many people are going to read that? Well, the answer is probably just one. Who? Well, the teacher, of course. So how motivated do you feel to write something for one person to learn? And does that change when you can publish it online and get 50, 60, 70, 80 likes? Right, Sherry, you can share it around the room, but it's still a very, very closed community. And you should bear this in mind. The more that you can make work public, the more motivating it becomes for students. So on that note, I'm going to give you a little idea. But before we do that, can I ask you whether you like prizes? Because this idea involves winning a prize. Oh, so he likes prizes. So does Mr. Mutar. Yes, absolutely. Celine, of course. Oh, Sarah, what do you mean it depends? Don't you like winning things? Oh, Starry, of course. Okay, so guess what? OUP is running a really exciting project competition. And this involves the students traveling back in a time capsule and making a poster for them. Now, if this is an idea that's interesting for you, then I've included the Q&R code, so you can just take a screenshot of my slide and then find out all the little details that you need to know to participate with your students in this. In case you're wondering just how difficult this project is, let me share some entries with you. So have a look at these lovely posters that the students have made. Okay. Sarah, so you have a problem with competitions in the classroom. Can you be more specific so we can think of strategies to help you? Right, going back to this project, the students have to step back in time and then make a poster for the time capsule so that visitors can then understand what our lives were like now. Right, now if you'd like to have all the little details, then I've included the Q&R code. So just take a screenshot and then download a Q&R code reader so that you can find out exactly how to participate in this. But time is ticking because the deadline is the 3rd of March, if memory serves me correctly. So you still have time to make an exciting project, but you can't sort of sit on your laurels. I'd also like to share this link with you. OUP does a lot of research to support us teachers. and it gets experts to write articles for us in papers, which are really, really quite interesting. And there's a fantastic one on project-based learning, which I highly recommend. Now, I've included the link for you, but I always think that this is a little bit more difficult than including the QR code. So I've got that for you as well. I have fantastic news. You can download these papers free of charge. So all you have to do is click on the download button, and they are made by experts. So they really are reliable. And again, I recommend this to you. Right, we're at 10 o'clock, which means that I need to shut up now. But before I go, I'd like to share a quote by Robin Sharma with you. And as you know, he's one of the world's top educational leaders, or leaders in general, really. And Sharma says that, well, change is hard at first. And it's true, projects will be difficult at first, both for the students and for you, because they're probably not used to this kind of approach. And yes, it's true, change is messy in the middle. And yes, projects do produce a lot of noise in the classroom, but there is such a thing as learning noise. But at the end, when you look and share that final end product that your children have made, then you can't help but smile and feel very, very proud of your shiny stars. And if that's not a good reason to try out a project, then I really don't know what is. So thank you everybody for having joined us today. It's been an absolute pleasure to be with you and to meet so many of you from around the world. I hope that this has been, well, although it's just the iceberg of project-based learning, I hope that it's motivated you to start and to think about questions and basically an approach of where do I start in this exciting world. And my last bit of advice for you would be baby steps. Start with a small project, make it doable, and then gradually build on to a more ambitious project until you're doing things that are absolutely wow. Right, now I'd like to come back to two questions that you asked throughout the webinar. And the first one was Alina's question, should we follow the syllabus? Well, Alina, if there's a syllabus, you need to follow it. But that doesn't mean that you can't find a project that contributes to the syllabus or is a different way of teaching your syllabus. So a project-based approach to learning is another tool in your teacher kit. It doesn't mean that you have to only teach through projects, but you can dip into that tool as you would into other tools, and every now and again introduce a project when it makes sense in your syllabus, right? Mr. Mutar is asking about the proportion of knowledge and skills. Well, there's no sort of maths formula for that, Mr. Mutar, but I think you need to think about the whole project and then think about different stages of it. When do you think that knowledge is more important? Then raise the knowledge factor in that task of the project. But then there are other moments where it's not so much about knowledge as it is about skills, and then raise the skills component of the project. But in either case, explain to students what they're doing and why they're doing it. So today we're focusing more on skills. Today I'm watching your skills because if you can do this, then, or because this helps us to. Make that absolutely clear for them, okay? Right, I don't know if there are any other questions. I don't see any more in the chat box. So a very, very big thank you to you. And I hope to see you online for more webinars. And thanks again to OUP for organizing these amazing moments where we get to speak to colleagues around the world and speak about issues which are very, very pertinent for our classrooms. So you will be sent the link to watch the webinar later on again if you'd like to. A big goodbye from me from Portugal, and thank you so much for participating. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you, Vanessa, and thank you all for joining in, and all the thank yous that you're getting in the box. So let me just wrap us up a little bit. So we did, obviously, said as we said, we recorded the